The P-51 gleamed impossibly in Berlin's airspace, where no American fighter should have been. Hans gripped his Messerschmitt's controls tighter, his throat dry as desert sand. Everything they'd believed, everything he'd sacrificed for, condensed into that silver silhouette dancing through flak clouds above the burning capital. The German pilot saw the American P-51 Mustang and admitted the Luftwaffe had lost the war in the air. His stomach twisted with the knowledge. They were now simply targets in their own sky, subscribed to witness the moment when victory becomes mathematically impossible. Hans Albrecht checked his oxygen mask one final time before taxiing onto the runway, the familiar vibration of the Messerschmitt Bf 109G beneath him, both reassuring and demanding. At 24, he'd already lived several lifetimes in the cockpit, each mission adding another layer to the calloused edges of his soul. The early morning air hung heavy with moisture, creating a ghostly shroud around the airfield as ground crews scurried with practiced efficiency, their breath visible in the cold December air. Their faces had changed over the years, younger now, some barely old enough to shave, but their movements remained the same, a dance of preparation and prayer without words. The radio crackled with reports of another bomber formation approaching from the west. American B-17s crawling across the sky like armored beetles, leaving destruction in their wake. Hans had intercepted them before, knew their patterns and vulnerabilities, had watched their gunners desperately tracking his approach through frosted plexiglass. The sky had been the domain of the Luftwaffe then, when interception meant the bombers would limp home, missing engines, wings torn by 20mm cannon shells, fuselages riddled with bullet holes. Those victories felt distant now, like faded photographs of summer celebrations from before the war, memories belonging to someone else entirely. The briefing that morning had been shorter than usual, the commanding officer's voice tight with controlled tension as he outlined their mission parameters. Intelligence reported a force of nearly 300 bombers, making their way toward the industrial heart of Berlin, escorted by fighters that seemed to linger longer with each raid. No one spoke the obvious truth, that the fighters shouldn't have the fuel capacity to reach this far into German airspace. Tactical adjustments were made, fuel mixtures recalculated, ammunition loads optimized for quick strikes against bombers before retreating from their escorts. Hans felt the familiar pre-mission hollowness in his stomach as his aircraft gained speed, the rumble of the Daimler-Benz engine drowning out the distant thunder of anti-aircraft batteries. The earth fell away beneath him as he pulled back on the stick, climbing through layers of cloud toward the combat ceiling where oxygen grew thin and thoughts became crystalline in their clarity. Other fighters rose alongside him, their formations less precise than they had once been, gaps in the patterns where experienced pilots should have been. They climbed in silence, conserving both fuel and radio discipline, each man alone with his thoughts and the mechanical symphony of his aircraft. At 20,000 feet, Hans leveled off, scanning the horizon for the telltale dots that would mark the approaching American formation. The sun glinted off his canopy, momentarily blinding him with golden light that filtered through high-altitude ice crystals. When his vision cleared, he saw them, dark specks against the blue-white backdrop, moving with the inexorable certainty of industrial warfare. His hand moved automatically to adjust his throttle, preparing for the diving attack that had become their standard tactic. The early warning had given them altitude advantage, at least, though their numbers were woefully inadequate against the approaching armada. As he banked toward the formation, something caught his eye. A flash of reflected sunlight from an unexpected angle, too high and too fast for a bomber. Hans blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks in the thin air, but the metallic gleam remained, circling above the bomber formation like a watchful predator. The realization struck him with physical force. The Americans had brought something new to the fight, something that defied the limitations that had previously governed the air war over Germany. In that moment, as the sleek silhouette of the P-51 Mustang came into focus against the pale blue sky, Hans felt the first true chill of defeat settle into his bones. The tactical briefing room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, the map on the wall marked with red pins showing the increasing penetration of Allied bombing raids. Hans sat in the back row, still wearing his flight suit, dirt and oil embedded under his fingernails from helping the ground crew patch his aircraft after the morning's engagement. The squadron had lost 3 more pilots, young men with fewer than 10 missions between them, their faces already beginning to fade from his memory like so many others. The Gruppenkommandeur stood before them, his uniform impeccable despite the chaos of the day, his voice steady as he described what intelligence had confirmed about the new American fighter. The P-51 Mustang carries drop tanks, the commander explained, tracing the enemy's route on the map with a wooden pointer that clicked against the glass with each emphasized point. These external fuel tanks double their range, allowing them to escort bombers all the way to targets deep within Reich territory. Once engaged, they jettison the tanks and retain their full combat capability. The room remained silent as the implications settled over the assembled pilots. Hans studied the technical diagrams now being distributed, sleek lines, laminar flow wings, and the critical detail that changed everything. A Rolls-Royce Merlin engine had replaced the Mustang's original power plant, transforming an unremarkable aircraft into something lethal. Outside, the December twilight was already deepening, the short winter day surrendering to darkness that would provide no respite from bombing. Through the narrow windows, Hans could see ground crews working by floodlight, patching runways and refueling the few serviceable aircraft remaining. Their movements were hurried yet precise, racing against time and the ever-present threat of night raiders that might target the airfield once darkness fell completely. The constant background noise of distant explosions had become so familiar that most men no longer flinched at the sound, their faces remaining impassive as the earth trembled beneath their feet. Production figures were projected onto the screen, and Hans felt his throat tighten as he absorbed the stark reality presented in clean, white numbers. American factories were producing nearly 15,000 Mustangs, while German production of advanced fighters remained in the hundreds, each aircraft meticulously crafted but outnumbered beyond any tactical compensation. The mathematics was merciless in its clarity. Each German pilot would need to shoot down dozens of enemies to merely maintain parity, an impossible task even for the most skilled veterans. The room temperature seemed to drop as the briefing continued. The cold certainty of industrial warfare laid bare in columns of production statistics. "We are implementing new tactics," the commander continued, his voice betraying no emotion as he outlined desperate measures. Concentrated attacks on bomber formations, avoiding engagement with fighter escorts when possible. Fuel reserves are to be strictly monitored. Unnecessary maneuvers will result in disciplinary action. The unspoken message hung in the air. Survive to fight another day, because replacements, both men and machines, were becoming scarce. Hans looked around at his fellow pilots, noting how many seats remained empty, how young the faces had become. Some still carried the brightness of belief in their eyes, while others stared at the briefing materials with the vacant expression of men already mourning their own inevitable deaths. As the briefing concluded, the commander hesitated, something unusual for a man known for his brusque efficiency. "The Führer has approved accelerated production of the Me-262 jet fighter," he said finally, a brief flicker of hope passing across his weathered features. "These aircraft will restore our advantage in the skies." Nobody mentioned the rumors they'd all heard. Fuel shortages, technical difficulties, bombed factories, and the critical shortage of trained pilots to fly such advanced aircraft. Hans remained seated as others filed out, studying the performance specifications of the Mustang until the pages blurred before his eyes, the numbers burning themselves into his memory like tracer rounds in the night sky. The maintenance hangar offered temporary shelter from the biting January wind, its cavernous space filled with the sounds of metal on metal and the occasional curse as mechanics wrestled with machines that had been pushed beyond their design limitations. Hans ran his hand along the cowling of his Messerschmitt, feeling the dents and patches that told the story of recent encounters. The aircraft had once seemed the pinnacle of aviation technology, clean lines and responsive controls that had made the Luftwaffe masters of the European skies during the early war years. Now it sat like a wounded predator, still dangerous but increasingly outmatched by newer, faster opponents. "She'll fly tomorrow," the chief mechanic said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long ago lost its original color. "But the supercharger is showing wear. High-altitude performance will be compromised." The man spoke with the intimate knowledge of someone who understood aircraft as living things, their mechanical hearts beating in time with the pilots who flew them. His face, lined with exhaustion and years of service, betrayed no emotion as he delivered what amounted to a death sentence for high-altitude interception missions. Hans nodded, knowing better than to ask about replacement parts that didn't exist or repairs that couldn't be made with the materials at hand. Across the hangar, a captured P-51 sat under guard, its distinctive silhouette incongruous among the German aircraft. Technical officers crawled over and inside it, measuring, photographing, and documenting every aspect of the machine that was changing the air war. Hans found himself drawn to it during moments between missions and briefings, studying the American fighter with the same intensity with which he might have studied an opponent in the sky. The Mustang's design was deceptively simple, its beauty lying not in complicated engineering, but in the elegant solution to the problem of long-range fighter escort, a marriage of American airframe and British engine that created something greater than either nation could have produced alone. 6 fuel tanks, explained the engineering officer who had been tasked with the Mustang's evaluation, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man accustomed to dealing in technical facts rather than emotional realities. 2 in each wing, 1 behind the pilot and the drop tanks, nearly double our effective range, even accounting for combat maneuvering. He tapped the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with something approaching reverence. And this changes everything. High-altitude performance that matches or exceeds our best fighters. With fuel efficiency we cannot match, given our current petroleum situation. The officer's assessment was delivered without emphasis, yet the words fell like bombs in the quiet hangar. Hans climbed onto the wing and peered into the cockpit, noting the simplicity of the controls, the thoughtful placement of instruments, the comfort afforded to a pilot who might spend hours at high altitude. The American approach to warfare was evident in every aspect of the design, not the perfectionist craftsmanship of German engineering, but the practical efficiency of mass production without sacrificing essential quality. He thought of his own aircraft, with its hand-fitted parts and meticulous construction, each one slightly different from the next, due to the artisanal nature of their manufacture. Beautiful machines, precisely crafted, and now being overwhelmed by standardized opponents rolling off assembly lines in unimaginable numbers. That evening, as darkness fell over the airfield, Hans sat alone in the pilot's mess. A technical manual opened before him, but his attention focused on the distant sound of air raid sirens beginning their mournful wail. The Americans had bombed by day. The British would come by night, a relentless cycle that allowed no recovery time for defenses or infrastructure. A few other pilots sat scattered around the room, each isolated in his own thoughts, the camaraderie of earlier days replaced by introspective silence. Hans closed the manual and watched frost patterns form on the windows, geometric crystalline structures spreading across the glass like cracks in the foundation of everything he had believed about German technical superiority. February brought clear skies and temperatures that froze the breath in men's lungs, perfect conditions for high-altitude bombing. Hans climbed toward the sun, leading what remained of his squadron to intercept the daily American formation approaching Berlin. Radio discipline had become stricter as the war progressed, the airwaves now frequently jammed or monitored by enemy intelligence. They flew in silence, each man alone with the roar of his engine and the knowledge carried from the previous day's losses. 8 aircraft ascended, where once there would have been 24, their diminished numbers a testament to the war of attrition being waged in the skies above the Reich. The bomber Stream appeared exactly as intelligence had predicted, flying with the arrogant precision that had become the hallmark of American daylight raids. Hans counted more than 200 fortresses arranged in tight combat boxes, their formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire from hundreds of machine guns. What had changed was their escort, not the occasional fighter briefly appearing before turning back due to fuel constraints, but a protective swarm of Mustangs, their silver bodies catching the sunlight as they patrolled above, below, and alongside the bombers. Hans keyed his microphone once, the predetermined signal to his pilots to focus on the bombers and avoid engagement with the escorts if possible. As he pushed his aircraft into a steep dive toward the lead bomber group, Hans caught movement from the corner of his eye, a Mustang braking formation, turning with impossible grace at an altitude where his own aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive. He instinctively adjusted his approach, abandoning the bomber attack to evade the incoming fighter. The American pilot anticipated his maneuver, staying with him through a series of turns that bled energy and altitude from both aircraft. Hans found himself descending into thicker air, where his Messerschmitt's handling improved, but the Mustang remained locked to his tail, matching every defensive maneuver with practiced ease. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes before Hans managed to break contact, diving toward cloud cover with emergency boost that strained his already compromised engine. Through a gap in the clouds, he glimpsed the aftermath of the intercepted bombing formation, German fighters falling in flames, parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the blue canvas of sky, and the inexorable progress of the bombers toward their target. Most telling was the behavior of the Mustangs, which no longer turned for home after brief engagements, but continued to hunt across the Reich's airspace with the confidence of predators in familiar territory. The sky that had once belonged unquestionably to the Luftwaffe now hosted uninvited guests who stayed as long as they pleased. That night, as searchlights carved white fingers through the darkness and anti-aircraft batteries fired with more desperation than accuracy, Hans stood on the airfield perimeter, watching the distant glow of Berlin burning. The city had become accustomed to fire, its inhabitants moving through daily routines between bombed buildings with the stoic resilience that had replaced earlier confidence in quick victory. A staff car pulled alongside him, and the window lowered to reveal his Gruppenkommandeur, face illuminated by the amber glow of a cigarette. "Tomorrow we relocate to a satellite field," the commander said without preamble. "The main runway will be unusable after tonight's raids." Hans acknowledged the order with a nod and continued staring at the burning horizon as the car pulled away. The relocation was another step in the ongoing retreat, from forward bases in occupied territories to the borders of the Reich, then deeper into Germany itself as Allied air power pushed them back. Now they would operate from improvised airstrips, concrete runways replaced by packed earth, proper hangars giving way to camouflage dispersal areas. The Luftwaffe was becoming a guerrilla force in its own airspace, striking when conditions favored them and hiding when they did not. As he watched another wave of distant explosions bloom against the night sky, Hans finally acknowledged the truth that had been growing within him since first seeing the Mustang. They were now simply guests in a sky owned by others. March brought the first hints of spring, pale green, pushing through blackened earth around the perimeter of the dispersal field that had become their new home. Hans supervised the camouflage netting being arranged over his aircraft, its fabric pattern designed to break up the distinctive silhouette when viewed from above. The Messerschmitt had been repaired again after the last mission, its engine replaced with one salvaged from 3 damaged aircraft, its ammunition load reduced to conserve weight and extend range. Every sortie now required careful calculation, not just of fuel and ammunition, but of the statistical probability of encounter and survival against overwhelming numbers. 37 operational aircraft across 3 Gruppen, the intelligence officer reported during the morning briefing, his tone suggesting he was simply conveying numbers without acknowledging their significance. Against an estimated 700 Allied fighters operating in our sector today. The briefing room was now a canvas tent, its walls shifting with each gust of wind, maps secured with wooden clothespins instead of mounted on proper boards. The assembled pilots received the information without visible reaction, their faces set in the mask of controlled fatalism that had replaced the confident expressions of earlier years. Mission parameters were outlined with emphasis on evasion tactics and disengagement procedures. The primary objective no longer to destroy enemy aircraft, but to survive and gather intelligence on bombing patterns. After the briefing, Hans walked alone through the makeshift airfield, passing ground crew who worked with quiet efficiency despite shortages of everything from proper tools to adequate food. A radio played softly from somewhere among the trees, the broadcast frequently interrupted by static as Allied jamming techniques grew more sophisticated. The announcer's voice maintained the confident tone mandated by propaganda directives, speaking of wonder weapons and strategic retreats while avoiding the reality that was evident to anyone who looked skyward. Hans stopped to listen to a report about armaments production, the impressive-sounding figures meaningless without context, a context provided daily by the hundreds of Allied aircraft darkening the sky above Germany. In the afternoon, a transport aircraft landed on their field, its arrival unscheduled and surprising given the fuel restrictions that had curtailed all non-essential flights. A small group of officers emerged, their immaculate uniforms marking them as staff from Berlin rather than operational commanders. They sequestered themselves with the Gruppenkommandeur in the operations tent, emerging hours later with grim expressions. After their departure, rumors spread quickly through the scattered personnel. The Me-262 jet production facilities had been bombed again, fuel reserves were critically low, and training programs had been further compressed to rush replacement pilots to the front. Most telling was the reallocation of anti-aircraft batteries from airfield defense to protect what remained of the synthetic fuel plants. That evening, as the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of red and gold, Hans sat in his cockpit, completing his pre-flight checks for the dawn patrol. The Messerschmitt felt like an extension of himself after hundreds of missions, every switch and gauge familiar under his fingers, even in the fading light. From this seated position, looking out over the aircraft's nose, he could almost believe in the possibility of victory. The perspective limited enough to exclude the broader strategic situation, focused only on the immediate task of flying and fighting. But as he completed the checklist and climbed down from the cockpit, the illusion faded, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. "The Americans built 15,000 Mustangs," said a voice from the shadows beneath the wing. Hans turned to find the engineering officer who had examined the captured P-51, his figure barely visible in the gathering darkness. 15,000 of their second-best fighter, while we struggled to produce a few hundred of our best. The man stepped forward, his face illuminated momentarily by the flame of a match as he lit a cigarette, the brief flare revealing eyes hollowed by exhaustion and knowledge. "The Luftwaffe didn't lose in the cockpit," he continued, exhaling smoke that mingled with his breath in the cool evening air. "We lost on the assembly line. Hans nodded silently, watching the last light fade from the sky that had once belonged to Germany and now played host to visitors who arrived in countless numbers. Delivered by factories an ocean away from the war, they were winning. Retrai l'esprit, epilogo. Definc paragraphos longos sem redundantias da historia acima. Edit epilogue. Ghosts in the machinery. Hans stood among the wreckage of what had once been the pride of German aviation, watching American technicians swarming over the remnants of the Messerschmitt development facility in the summer of 1945. The war had ended, not with the dramatic last stand they had been promised, but with a whimper of fuel starvation and overwhelming industrial might. The Americans moved with purpose, cataloguing, photographing, and crating components of aircraft that had never progressed beyond prototype stage. Designs that might have changed the course of the air war if they had reached production 9 months earlier. They spoke loudly in their flat, nasal English, unafraid of being overheard in a country now firmly under Allied control, their casual confidence the final confirmation of a victory that had been mathematically inevitable since the Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. The technical officer who had accompanied Hans on this final assignment paused beside a half-assembled Me-262 fuselage, running his fingers along the smooth metal skin as one might touch a fallen comrade. "They're taking everything," he murmured, gesturing toward trucks being loaded with documents, engine components, and test equipment. Not just the aircraft, but the knowledge, the techniques, the entire philosophy of our design approach. Around them, engineers who had once crafted the world's most advanced fighter aircraft now stood with hands in pockets, reduced to spectators as their life's work was dismantled and prepared for shipment across the Atlantic. The summer breeze carried the scents of machine oil and freshly cut timber from the crates being assembled, along with the more subtle odor of defeat that seemed to permeate everything in post-war Germany, a compound of despair, resignation, and the first tentative stirrings of relief that the dying had finally stopped. An American colonel approached them, his uniform crisp despite the dust and heat of the disassembly operation, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "You, Albrecht?" he asked, consulting a list before Hans could answer. "Fighter pilot, Jagdgeschwader 27, 37 confirmed kills." Hans nodded, suppressing the instinctive urge to stand at attention before this representative of the victorious power. The colonel studied him with the evaluating gaze of a man accustomed to assessing both machinery and those who operated it, his eyes lingering on the faded flight insignia still sewn to Hans's civilian jacket. "We're interviewing Luftwaffe pilots about combat experiences against the P-51, he explained, gesturing toward a makeshift office set up in what had once been the facility's administration building. Operational details, tactical responses, comparative performance analyses, the technical stuff, not political. Later, seated across from 2 American intelligence officers, Hans found himself describing aerial encounters in the dispassionate language of a professional, discussing his craft with others who understood the unforgiving physics of air combat. They recorded his words on a wire device, occasionally interrupting with questions about specific maneuvers or engine performance at various altitudes, their interest entirely technical rather than triumphant. Through the office window, Hans could see the distant silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs parked on the former Luftwaffe airfield, their presence no longer an anomaly, but the new natural order, silver predators at rest after the hunt. The questions continued until sunset, the Americans seemingly insatiable in their desire to understand every aspect of the air war from the perspective of those they had defeated, their approach to victory as methodical and thorough as their approach to industrial production. As twilight settled over the dismantled facility, Hans walked alone to the perimeter fence, gazing at contrails etched across the darkening sky by transport aircraft, ferrying occupation personnel and equipment across a conquered continent. The white lines faded slowly, ephemeral monuments to the mastery of air that had ultimately decided the war's outcome. A formation of Mustangs passed overhead, returning to base after a patrol mission, their engine sound distinctive and now familiar to every German who had lived through the final years of conflict. Hans watched them until they disappeared into the gathering darkness. These machines that had transformed the war through the simple equation of excellent design multiplied by overwhelming production capacity. The mathematical certainty of defeat had been written in the sky long before the final surrender, visible to anyone who had counted the aircraft rising to meet them and understood the industrial reality they represented. The sky belonged to those who could fill it, not just with quality, but with quantity that transformed quality into an irrelevant footnote in the harsh textbook of modern warfare.